Everybody, it is 3 p.m. on July 30th, 2020, so we can begin. This is going to be the first broadcasted roundtable of artists from the Branching Owl, Works in Wood from North Carolina exhibition that Brom is hosting. We here, the staff of Brom has been fortunate enough to be able to enjoy this exhibit since mid-March, and patrons are finally allowed to start entering our gallery and appreciating this well. So as a way to kind of add some more life to this exhibit, wanted to record these conversations since we're not able to do them in person and then distribute them. We've also already, we have some calls, like one-on-one talks we've done with other artists in the exhibit like Aspen Golann and Bob Trotman that we'll be adding to the conversation. And so it'll be really nice at the end of this to kind of see, you know, what all you artists have in common and where you kind of differ in your history and your paths to the medium. And your pursuits with it. So just some brief background about the artists we have on the call today. So we have Erik Wolken. Erik was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1961. He first became interested in working with wood during his college days, and he had limited tools on his back porch, but he built his earliest pieces and later studied furniture design at Indiana University of Pennsylvania in the fine woodworking program at Haywood Community College. And he also worked in a cabinet shop in the early 90s before opening his own studio in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where he still resides. Erik's path as an artist has traveled from being a traditionally trained furniture maker to incorporating a more sculptural aesthetic in his furniture work, to finally exploring pure sculpture, and to the fluidly moving between all three, from furniture to fine art to sculptural work. His guiding light is to find rhythm in poetry that is a confluence of lines, color, texture, and graphic imagery that tells a narrative. At its most basic, his work is about storytelling. We also have Zak Weinberg. Zak is a sculptor and fabricator who received his Bachelor of Fine Arts and certification in Public Architecture and Art from Florida State University in 2016. He currently resides in Raleigh, North Carolina, and is an assisting artist with Thomas Sayre and Clearscapes with their public art projects. Through the alter ego Gravenu Kaz, his name backwards, he has a creative relationship that has been forged with a laser cutter. So together, Gravenu and the laser cutter create machine fabricated wood relief sculptures, and they draw inspiration from the visual dialect of architecture, cultural patterns, historic symbolism, and motif. Each piece is an expression of universal language to celebrate the harmonious balance of difference. And then we have Brent Skidmore. Brent is an artist and educator, and he received his Bachelor of Fine Arts in Sculpture and Functional Art from Murray State University in 1987, followed by a Master's in Fine Art and Sculpture from Indiana University in 1990. While his background is in sculpture, he primarily makes studio furniture, and otherwise he can be found teaching and promoting change through collaborative making in the Asheville community. Brent is an assistant professor at UNC Asheville, and he also serves as a board member for the Center for Craft, Creativity, and Design, working to advance the awareness and importance of craft in academia and the mainstream. So I'm just really honored to have the three of you all together, and I'm really excited to kind of hear your different takes on these questions. So the questions I'm going to ask have been prepared by myself and our curator, Diana Cameron. How did you start working with wood? And was there anyone in particular who taught you?
Two guys. I started working mostly in wood because I went to Murray State University thinking I needed to be a graphic designer so I could make a living. That was in 1983. And I think you could still do that in 1983 as a graphic designer. Now there's a lot of graphic designers. And then I took a 3D design class with a guy named Steve Bishop who was teaching there. And then more importantly, my mentor at Murray State University was Paul Sasso. And I don't know if anybody knows Paul's work, but he's trained as a painter, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's a Canadian. Not that that matters a whole lot, mostly with his wit because he grew up in Windsor. And both of those guys, I was really lucky because they came into teaching really young, and they came in very excited. This was 83 to 87. And they came in basically competing for students, and I got to be one of the students they competed for. So basically, I basically double majored in functional art and sculpture. So I had a foundry at my disposal. I had a complete wood shop at my disposal, and I had mostly Paul making fun of me as the only 40-year-old he knew. I was about, what was I, 22, I think 21 when he said that to me, or 20 years old when he said that to me. So, and both of those guys had really good work ethics. So, but I would lay most of the woodworking on Paul Sasso. Definitely the painting of wood on Paul, and give him credit for that, got me quickly addicted to airborne particulates, which I didn't protect myself from for a number of years, which probably resulted in cancer at some point. So, everybody wear your respirator.
Great. Well, thank you for the health tips and some insight into your background as well. So Erik, same question for you. How did you get started working with wood? And was there a teacher in particular who got you hooked?
No, not really. When I was an undergraduate at West Virginia University, I was wandering around what was then known as the Agricultural and Engineering Library, and I was just probably avoiding doing my homework. And I ran across a Wendell Castle book. I ran across the Wendell Castle book of wood lamination, and for some reason, it just really caught my fancy. And I was fascinated because I had no background in woodworking before that. I mean, I hadn't done anything, but for some reason I looked at this book and it seemed to open up a world of possibilities. So I started in my own primitive way, just making stuff on my back porch in West Virginia. I took a circular saw and screwed it to a piece of plywood and did all sorts of incredibly dangerous things. And it was all fairly primitive. And then I took a workshop or two up in Pennsylvania. And then I eventually ended up, actually through my mother's encouragement, enrolling in the program in furniture design. This is after I had already done my undergraduate degree at WVU. Enrolling in the program in furniture design at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which wasn't really that far from Morgantown. And Chris Weiland was the lead instructor there. And I just studied with him for one semester because he went on sabbatical right after I got there, something he never told me he'd planned on doing. And so from there, I left that program and then I went and studied with Wayne Rabb at Haywood Community College, the excellent program there. And I didn't finish that program. I went from there straight to a large cabinet shop in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and that was really the completion of my education, because I had learned lots of design and technical woodworking skills from Wayne, who was a wonderful instructor. And then I just got thrown right into the practical everyday of what's known as the box banging business. We cranked out cabinets for IBM and for all the big companies in Research Triangle Park. And I lasted at that 2-3 years, doing some small pieces on my own, but just sort of realizing that I was never gonna reach my dreams of really doing my own thing. And I really hated working in a cabinet shop. So I opened up my own studio and I just started exploring with the ideas I'd had in my head from Indiana and from Haywood. And I just started making things, and that's sort of where I've been ever since.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, that's my background. Many influences, because I've always looked at other people's work. Always. I've always stolen like an artist, I think, as the phrase goes.
Well, that's great. And I hope your techniques you're using now are a lot safer than a circular saw attached to a 2x4.
Piece of plywood.
All right. So moving on to plywood, we've got one artist in the exhibit who works a lot with plywood, and that's Zak. So Zak, how did you start working with wood? And was there an instructor in particular who got you hooked, or a person in your life?
So I was definitely more just self-taught through experimentation. My work is obviously not traditional woodworking by any means. Originally, when I first started sculptural work, I was using tree branches, so the wood in its most natural form. And I went to school with the intention of being a tattoo artist, and I was fascinated by the culture and machinery and process in that, but I learned I was terrible at drawing pretty quickly. But I picked up Adobe Illustrator in one of my early classes and got really good at graphic design and took on a lot of commission work, which boosted my skills pretty quickly. I learned that our school had a lab with a laser cutter, and I figured, when am I ever going to have the opportunity to use one of these? So I translated some of the graphic design work I was doing to the laser cutter. So for me, wood is more of a functional aspect to it. It cuts on the machine quickly and efficiently. The alchemical processes you can do to transform the material is very intriguing, and I find a lot of joy through that freedom of experimentation. However, the machine itself can handle various materials, just acrylic or leather or anything we can engrave as well as cut. So there was kind of the aspects of wanting to stay more in the natural, sustainable realm. And I really enjoyed traditional kumiko, like screening and stuff in Japanese culture. And then I was also very inspired by David Best, who is the temple builder for Burning Man. And he creates massive structures out of CNC plywood and such. So it was this whole combination of all of the above that kind of led to what I do now. Yeah.
Very cool. That's funny. Started out wanting to do tattoos, and I realized really quick I cannot draw.
Yeah.
Is that one of your paintings behind you, or is that from a different artist?
Oh, that's actually a friend from college. Her name's Mary Williams, but obviously that guy is my new piece. So yeah, I did painting and tried to incorporate some of my paintings in sculpture. I took some higher level art courses and learned Old Masters Miche technique, and I love it, but it's an incredibly time consuming and tedious process. So painting's more for fun. I don't sell my paintings because I don't view them on the same level as my other work, but I hope one day I'll get good enough and confident in that medium.
Yeah, it's just interesting how, three of you all come from different backgrounds and finding a way into an attachment to wood and a way to work with it. So that's really cool to see how, we all come from a different place of inspiration and a place of connection. So Brent, I know that you're an instructor, but for Erik and Zak, is teaching woodworking important to your work at all? And if so, why is teaching important to you?
I guess I can answer that. I mean, obviously, I've taught a little bit. I've taught a couple of workshops in Pittsburgh where I grew up at the Society for Contemporary Craft, and I have been Dean Pulver's assistant twice when he was at Penland. So, I mean, certainly, teaching hasn't been a big part of what I do, but teaching is a big part of, I think, the learning process, because I think all of us that have been to school can see that, being in a school program, you get the chance to experiment and learn a lot of technique in a very short period of time. I mean, if I had, not had my school experiences, it would have taken me another 10 years to learn the techniques and the processes and experiment. And I guess it, not to plug something I'm doing, but I will anyways. I also do a podcast called Why Make with my good friend Rob Helmkamp down in Charleston, South Carolina, another maker. And I sort of view that as educational as well. I mean, basically we're talking to other people that work in the wood medium and asking them what inspires them to make. And we're not asking technical questions, but we're asking questions of where do ideas come from? And I view that very much as an oral history of people in this profession, people working with wood, and hopefully we're gonna archive that all down the road. And I view that as educational, as people knowing what other makers out there are doing and where they arrive at inspiration.
So Zach, do you teach at all?
Yeah, so I'll plug something as well. I actually have a Patreon, and I present graphic design tutorials on there. So I teach about like my process and exactly how I make my work, but I also teach a lot of different graphic design software. I've only been doing it for about a month now, so we're focusing a lot on Illustrator, but I hope to teach more in Photoshop and other like 3D rendering programs. I taught a workshop and had an artist residency at Duke University a year ago and taught about Illustrator for laser cutting. I work in a public art fabrication studio, so I have like a very vast wealth of knowledge, but I wouldn't say I'm a pro by any means. So I completely agree with Erik that education, not only for others, but for yourself, is beneficial to your career and inspiration. And I hope I can go to Penland one day and learn some legit craft, as well as I'd love to travel to Japan and learn Kamiko from a professional master in those regards. So yeah, I definitely agree that education in all levels is important for whatever you're interested in. For me personally, teaching more about the modern machinery in laser cutting, 3D printing, CNC, etc., I think is very important because we're seeing the utilization and efficiency of those machines for creation and sustainability in our future. And I think the more those objects and equipment become commercialized and available for the everyday maker, people will start to see just how much possibility and whatever you want to make, you can create. You don't need years and years of knowledge to achieve that. You just need dedication and the equipment. So I want to continue that line of knowledge for others.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just interesting just how with you're combining laser cutting with woodworking and able to incorporate the new technology of the graphic design software into using one of the oldest artistic mediums around. So Brent, you're our formal educator in the group. So is the teaching aspect important to your work as well, or what do you get out of teaching?
After having a studio well over 30 years, my own personal work being made many times, being in that studio 7 to 8 years full time outside of academia, making a much better living than I made now, but working a lot harder, by the way, some days. I realized that my call is to be a teacher. So I don't ever have this dynamic that I meet a lot actually in other artists who teach, who are burdened with one or the other, or they're more burdened with the teaching and not ever burdened with their studio. But I've always had a calling to be a teacher. So I decided a long time ago to choose one road that would probably limit how many exhibitions I would be in, limit the amount of studio time I would have. And then what I really realized recently is the most important thing, and the thing I enjoy the most about teaching, is that I get to be in a space where someone else self-realizes and they are able to put together their artistic voice. I can be a support in that, inside of an academic structure, inside of Penland, inside of Anderson Ranch, or countless places I've taught that I'm really blessed to have been. New favorite place, Haystack, by the way, if you haven't gone. So I feel at home in that space, to where I don't have this huge depth of knowledge that I think I can impart. I also can get really far from my ego in that space if I stand in support of somebody else. But recently, the things that I've worked on in academia that mean the most are spaces to where, they're projects to where I create space, gather the resources, possibly help design the project, maybe not, maybe just get out of the way of that too, and then bring together what are usually the best places it's multi-generational. So it's, middle schooler, college student, 30-something octogenarian, then I'm set, because basically I can get out of the way. And what I find is that in any of those spaces, education is not really what's happening for me. It's actually an opening of the heart. It's an opening of a possibility that I've got to work with this other person to get something else done. So it's a promotion and perpetuation of collaboration, knowing that I can't do it alone. Just things that have been radical shifts in my life have come into my classroom. It's like, why leave them outside the classroom? And specifically in academia, I find it very frustrating that you can go through, I did it myself, go through, 2 degrees in art and never have a conversation about why do I make things? How about you make things because you want to stay sane? Because you need a place to, you need a place to land, you need a place to express yourself, or I want a place to land, I want a place to express myself. So my shift with leadership roles at UNCA and in developing the STEAM studio there, which is a 12,000 square foot making space, combining our mechatronics and art program together. So we basically make anything in a tiny little factory there. But my push to do any of that stuff is to really think about how we can work well outside of what academia has been working, specifically as it relates to art education, because without digital technologies advancements, it might be sitting there in the same space. But for me, what's exciting is to take in the digital technologies, say that Zak's using, and then bring in like the oldest, bring in a Ming Dynasty textural technique, and how do I put those things together? So stays a pretty vibrant place for me. I barely get to the studio, except for right now. I've got more commissions than I've had in 5 years. So,
yeah, and it's a very beautiful way of putting it. Just how you kind of get to step outside of yourself and create the space for other people to self-actualize. And after, being an artist, so much of it is being in your own space, being in your own head, that it can you can get stagnant in that. So that's nice that you've kind of found a way for you to step outside of that. And I'm sure it helps you be inspired when you have time to work. So Brent, you're in the hot seat. Would you consider your work more functional or sculptural, or do you work in a combination of the two?
Well, the stuff that's in that exhibition is much more sculptural because it's all sculptural. It has some reference to function, because what you have there, what do you have? You have you have one piece that has tiny little furniture in it. I didn't even make those pieces. Some brilliant person in Portland, Oregon made those tiny little pieces. Mini Mod, I think, is what they are on Etsy. And then we've got that piece, which is, a found chair, altered found chair. So those are all very sculptural pieces. So if I were to say, what do I make? If you go to the website, there's a lot of stuff that's just furniture. It's very sculptural in its approach, but it's and then you have the 3 most important pieces I've probably made in, I don't know, maybe my artistic career. Why they're important to me in that way is because of the meaning of them. So it has nothing to do with function or sculpture. I'll probably always have them unless somebody wants to buy them. But the piece on the wall is a very meaningful piece. All of those pieces are extremely meaningful. Transition in life. So primarily right now, I'm shifting back to making some functional work, because that's usually where the commissions come from. So I just finished a giant pedestal to go under a copper sink for Lee Rockamora up in your neighborhood, who's a supporter of the museum. A beautiful pedestal that goes under this giant copper bowl. And then right now I'm working on a king size bed, 2 side tables, a buffet for Scottsdale, Arizona client, and another buffet, which I'll meet those folks this week. So it's going to be more functional coming up. And then when I get that out of the way, I'll go back to making sculpture that maybe my kids get.
Yeah, very cool. I guess it's the season for everything. And yeah, your pieces here are very powerful. And it's really just amazing what you're able to do with wood. Some of the stuff they look more like stones or metal rods than actual carved and painted wood. So it's really impressive. And I just got to say, I'd be amazed to see what your bed turns out looking like with seeing what your other pieces.
You mean the king size bed I'm talking about? Well, I sleep in a pretty nice bed. That's my bed. But this will be a different piece than that, because if I put that much color, it wouldn't go with the amazing painting that's hanging over this. There's a painting that's hanging over is 15 feet long by 6 or so feet, 5 or 6 feet. So it's going to probably be a little bit calmer than the painting. So it'll make the painting shine. So
Yeah, very cool.
probably more textural than anything. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're really just get some incredible textures on your work. So Erik, same thing for you. Do you consider your work more functional or sculptural, or do you kind of pick and choose when to work with one or the other?
Well, I mean, at this point in my career, all my work is purely sculptural, but it all reflects my background as a functional maker. I mean, if you think about at least two of the pieces in there, I mean, one of them, the Troubled Waters piece, definitely is a cabinet form. It's got doors. It could be a functional piece if somebody wanted to use it as a functional piece. It wasn't never meant to be a functional piece. It was always meant to be purely a sculptural piece. So that definitely harkens back to my days as a box banger and building cabinetry. The gardening tools, You Dig, which is directly over your shoulder, I mean, that was just a whimsical take. I had to do a show. I had to do a themed show called, it was called Harvest. And I couldn't find my way into that show because all of my ideas just seemed trite as can be. I mean, it all leans towards cornucopias and vegetables and all these things that just didn't either felt trite or felt just not me. So I really struggled with it. And then I thought, well, I mean, what's more humble to a furniture maker than the tools? So I created these sort of whimsical gardening tools, and they 100% allude to function, but are utterly unfunctional. I mean, actually the title for that piece is Useless Objects with Which to Dig Deeper. Because that's the whole idea. The idea is, well, what does function really mean? What are these objects about? Are they about gardening and growing and all of those things? Or are they just useless objects? Sculpture, in a nutshell. Sculpture, useless objects. And then the last piece is Faces of the Future, those 10 pieces. Those obviously were never meant to be functional. And that piece was, again, like most of my pieces, it evolves over a long period of time. I have a good friend of mine, Gray Griffin, who is an incredible painter in Chapel Hill. And we talked about doing a collaboration for a really long time. And I basically started it. It was one of those pieces that's essentially, you know, the exquisite corpse idea, you know, where a author starts a chapter and hands it off to the next writer and the next writer. So I just created these pieces that in many cases were inspired by the skateboard art of George Peterson. And I'd seen a show he had done at Blue Spiral. And more than anything, I liked the format and the feel of it. And obviously I didn't have access to old skateboard decks. I don't know any skateboard punks.
That's because George has them all.
Oh, exactly. So I thought, well, what can I use that has this feel of sort of really funky? I didn't know what it was. So I just started experimenting with oriented strand board, which is truly nasty stuff to work with. You talk about toxic dust, that's oriented strand board. And so I started carving all these mask faces based off this book I'd heard about called Faces of the Future, which was an Asian American woman who was talking about her experience as a woman of color. And actually, I never said anything to my collaborator, Gray, about that. I didn't even give her the name that I was thinking of, Faces of the Future. And I gave her all these pieces and I just said, go to town, it's yours now. And that's the way it was. I came up with the first half of the idea, she completed it and did an incredible job. I mean, the pieces just became so much more expressive and so much more interesting as she worked with them. I mean, and when I attempted to paint one or two of them, they were based on more what I couldn't do because I'm not nearly as comfortable as color. They were monochromatic and uninteresting, and then all of a sudden she just made them sing. So that's the origins of the pieces I have.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, the faces of the future are very charismatic and yeah, vibrant. And they have a lot of life to them. And I'm glad that skateboards were part of the inspiration, because the first thought I had is like, those look like skateboards. And
Yeah, that's exactly where they came from.
mm-hmm.
Somebody a friend of mine suggested that I ought to put wheels on them. And I didn't want to drive home the analogy that far. It was like, yeah, I mean, that almost makes it feels like a functional object.
Or just take the images, like the designs, and make it a printed decal that goes on the bottom of a blank skateboard.
Yeah.
That could be cool. Very, very fun, very whimsical, very funky stuff that you got. And yeah, and then your cabinet has a very more heavy environmentalist note to it too. So.
Yeah, and it didn't start that way at all. It didn't. I mean, like most of my work, it evolves. Again, I had to do a piece for a themed show called Water Is, and I didn't know what my in was. I didn't know where to start. You know, again, with these really broad themed shows, you have to think, what's your in? What's your into this idea? And I belong to a community garden that is space from an old abandoned waterworks for Chatham County. And I like that idea, the old abandoned waterworks, and I started to think about that. And then on the grounds of the community garden, I found that big valve handle, which was actually part of the abandoned waterworks. And that's where that piece started. That piece started with that found valve handle. And from there, I said, oh, what can I do with some pipes? Could I carve some wooden pipes? And then I thought, well, it's got to have water. And then I started thinking about water pollution, and then, you know, those sewage outfalls and imagery and all of that. And, you know, it was a process. The piece didn't just come as one. The piece came in many different smaller pieces and took, you know, probably 6 to 8 weeks before I actually had the finished idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great how it can evolve, and I mean, you're drawing inspiration from these different sources. I think that really shines through in your work. So Zak, do you consider your work more functional or sculptural, or do you ever try to work in a combination of the two?
So if I were to separate my gallery work from my work, then yeah, my gallery work is definitely sculptural, but I make all sorts of things with the laser. So by the way, my laser's name is Yuga. So I'm going to refer to Yuga by their name from now on. So yeah, Yuga and I do a lot of miscellaneous fabrication work all around. So, you know, we engrave awards and plaques and make signs. I make functional objects like lamps and lighting for homes. Really anything that I can make with Yuga, I will. And so I've done like commissioned privacy screens for a tattoo shop in Durham. I like modified my own items at my house. Like I made some screened panels for my speakers so my cats would stop tearing at the foam inserts in them. Backsplashes and, you know, kitchens and accent pieces for air vents and things. So really, like, whatever we can put patterns on and make, we will do it. I also have a 3D printer named Momo, and we make all sorts of things together as well. Right now, we've been focusing on making PPE for hospitals and medical professionals, and, you know, fighting COVID. So I print out face shields and the like headgear for. I actually have one right here. Yeah, so face shields. So 3D printed parts, top and bottom, and then cut the PETG plastic out on Yuga, and then we donate to hospitals. I've also had some people like specifically ask me for them, not in the medical industry because there's such a shortage. So I think I've sent some out to like dentists and teachers, and yeah, just trying to do our part. Again, you know, utilize the machinery to collaborate and contribute to the community and then the greater good of things. And I think especially now, the idea of, you know, banding together and using our resources is very necessary, and I'm very grateful that I have the ability to do so.
Yeah, and then how can you as a maker contribute during this time. And then that's cool that you're able to use your collaborators, Momo and Yuga, to do that. And I think it's really cool Yuga, that you try, like, that they are your collaborators because the machines themselves have their own limitations and their own abilities that they can do. So you're working within that. I think that's really cool, and that's awesome that you've given them a name and kind of given.
Yeah, they have their own little lights, Another interesting aspect of what you said, their limitations is even within my sculptural work, there's still some functional aspects to it. So for example, the piece behind you, that is, like 4x6, my machine's only 28x40. So I've developed a process that I call hidden joinery, in which I utilize the kerf of the laser to create my own joinery. So there's something, that's like traditional woodworking is joinery in different types, but with the laser, I can literally create whatever type of joinery. It doesn't have to be dovetail or anything. It could be zigzag puzzle piece joinery, but because I can separate the files, but use that same cut line, that like tolerance of the kerf makes it so they fit back together. So in the sandwiching of the layers, there's sections where there's joinery that connects the pieces, and then through the process of lamination, you're able to oversize the work. And then so like the piece behind me was another like kind of experimentation based off that idea, was how do I make larger work that's not a single piece, because every time I move that piece behind you, I am afraid for its life because it's incredibly fragile. So yeah, the functional aspects of the machines also do relate back to the sculptural work. I think they go hand in hand, and it's truly the relationship I have with them.
Very cool. And yeah, and the layers that you use for your pieces are so small too. I mean, they're so thin.
It's all like 1/8 inch. It's like 2.7 millimeter birch ply. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very impressive. Puzzles, very much.
Yes, truly.
Zach, really stunning work, brother. I hadn't seen your work.
You.
Really amazing.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's cool seeing. I was checking out Zach's Etsy page too, because you have work of all different scales on there too. So it's
that's more of my production work and small made to order items.
So you could commission a large like 6x8 piece, or kind of take home a nice 8-inch disc to put on your wall too. Very, very cool.
Can you put the Etsy site in the chat, please?
Sure.
Okay.
And what kind of laser is Yuga?
Yuga is an Epilogue Fusion M2, 120 watt CO2.
Okay. What's that CO2 part?
So there's two like types of lasers. There's CO2 or fiber. So CO2, it's a tube of what is that? Carbon dioxide and gases, which an electrical pulse creates a photon beam that is then focused through a series of mirrors and lenses that create the laser. A fiber laser has a fiber in it that generates that, and they're much more powerful. So like CO2 lasers, you can have giant CO2 lasers with insane amounts of wattage that will get through different materials, but a fiber laser can punch through like, I don't know, inch thick metal, like really quickly and cleanly. It's insane.
Yeah, we have a, oh man, what is it? The red one. I don't remember what type it is, but it's 2x4, and it is a CO2 laser too.
Yeah.
2x4 bed. It's International Laser, I think is what it's called. Something pretty benign name. Too expensive, I can tell you that. And probably Epilogue maybe.
Yeah, I've been paying off Yuga for the past 3 years, and I sent in my final payment a week ago. Yuga is free. We can now have fun.
Oh, that's cool. And so North Carolina has a rich history of furniture making. And was this a factor in any of y'all's decision to work in the state? And has your time in North Carolina shaped your work in any way?
Well, I guess I'll jump into the fray here. So I came to North Carolina to go to Haywood. I hadn't really thought about much beforehand, although I did have a good friend who actually started, was in the appropriate technology program at App State in Boone. And I had visited him. We were both WVU graduates, and I had visited him a couple of times, but coming down here Haywood had an opening and I went. So I hadn't really thought in terms of any long-term history of the state of making as this being a destination. That being said, I've lived here 30 years now. And obviously the state has a lot to offer in terms of Penland, in terms of its art institutions. So have I taken advantage of any of it? I've certainly been to Penland. Certainly, places like Asheville where, you can throw a rock and hit a dozen artists at once. There's some great institutions in North Carolina Museum. North Carolina Museum of Art is an incredible institution. I don't know anything beyond that. I don't know where else I would live at this point. Although I got to admit, at least down here in Chapel Hill, the summers are just getting more brutal every year. It's really hard to live down here in the flatlands when the temperature is 98 and the heat index is 110.
Yep, that's why I moved to the mountains from Eastern North Carolina. So I can empathize with you all roasting down there in the Triangle right now. So Brent, does the history of North Carolina's furniture making heritage, did that factor into you working in the state at all, or is North Carolina?
I think my first time to North Carolina coming here to work was I had to get a divorce and get a job, kind of like in the same kind of time period. So I moved to Charlotte and then just started to discover the heritage of furniture making heritage in North Carolina. And then fast forward about 13 years, I moved up to Michigan, and basically there's a direct link between Grand Rapids, Michigan, and High Point, North Carolina, with the furniture market. So then start to know a little bit more about mass manufacturing furniture market, and then start to teach craft history through our art history courses at UNCA, and then basically learned that for almost 30 years, with the exception of a few years in Grand Rapids, I've lived in what is the seat of settlement schools, which includes Penland, Arrowmont, Krosnor, just keep going on Berea, all these places that were built and developed around Appalachian crafts, and then what were very benevolent, generous people that came here to give their time and money and efforts to get those crafts out. So I would say by some divine influence that I ended up in North Carolina, and then I do think it influences the work, specifically the sculptural work, specifically in some understanding of manufactured furniture, specifically as it's appropriated, changed, and used in the work. But it was never really like, I'm like Erik. I ended up here by chance. I remember telling my mother that the sky was way bluer here and they called it Carolina blue. And she's like, "What are you talking about? It's the same sky we got in Kentucky." And I'm like, no. It's actually not. So, and I've been here pretty much since. Don't plan on going anywhere else. And who would not, want to live in Asheville area? So that's where I am right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a great seat of creativity and natural beauty over in Asheville. And yeah, so Zak, you said earlier that you got into art mainly for tattooing, but then so has North Carolina shaped your work in any way, or is furniture making factored in at all for you?
So I actually had no idea that North Carolina was such a huge furniture capital of the country. I moved up here specifically to work for Thomas Sayre, who is a concrete and metal sculptor primarily. So in our shop, we do woodworking, but it's not fine woodworking by any means. It's mold making and crate building and using wood for structural stuff. But so I learned about the furniture making because when I first moved up here and got Yuga, I went into debt pretty quickly and picked up 2 other jobs, one of which was bartending freelance. And I got a gig at a furniture expo in High Point. And I was like, what is happening here? And so I was just like thrown into it and mind blown at all the amazing furniture making in the state. And so I unfortunately have not had much opportunity to delve into it and learn more and get the fine woodworking experience that I hope to achieve one day. But the state definitely has influenced my life and my work. You know, working in different media than what you do, I think is very beneficial because it kind of removes yourself. Like Brent was saying about teaching, you know, that you kind of lose your ego in working for someone else and then kind of manifesting like their creations. And so you can use a different part of your brain throughout the day while you kind of gain influence and inspiration in other means. I would say more so the opportunities and connections I've made in the state have influenced me a lot than just like the traditions and history here. However, I do try to find inspiration in various things like NCMA's Be Here Now exhibition a year or so ago, the big installation stuff, like seeing Anila Akhtar's cube was amazing, and Kuzama Infinity installation, Donald Judd, I think, had worked there, and it was awesome getting to see some of that stuff, which I don't think I would have had the opportunity if the museum wasn't 20 minutes away from my house, you know? So yeah, the wealth of inspiration, natural beauty, creativity and opportunity here is definitely, I made the right decision. Yeah, I love living here.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that North Carolina, this state in the South on the Eastern Seaboard, is such a hub for craft and for art and creativity, really. I mean, by y'all in the Triangle, you're around one of the highest concentrations of PhDs in the world with Research Triangle Park. Brent in Asheville, you're in one of the cities that's known for being a hub of creativity and of making. So it's really cool just to see how, you know, all of y'all are kind of getting influences from different places, and that this state really kind of has nurtured that creativity in you all. So this one kind of follows along with the tradition of furniture making. So when do you all choose to follow tradition, maybe through forms or through technique? And when do you choose to experiment? And have you managed to kind of transform any traditional processes and make them your own?
I could touch on that last part of that. Well, I could touch on the first part of it too, is pretty much have ignored most of tradition in furniture making. And then if I could do it faster, like my friend Pete Galbert, who makes the most stunning Windsor chairs by hand, you know, if I could do it faster with the grinders, then I might race him, and lose, basically, by the way. But so none of that's really crept in. But your last part of your question is which part have I transformed? And that's a lot of the textures in the work. Or, you know, pyrography's been around for a long time, so that one's a fairly simple one to burn texture in, to burn wood. I heard Zak talk about the alchemical properties of wood, which I really appreciate further and further as I use it more. And then the other one would be the mingding process. That's what I call it because I couldn't remember the name of it in a book, a Penland book on woodworking. I think it's chapter 10, but basically it's just a really simple textural. It's ukibori is what it is, and it's you can find it in the Ming Dynasty on furniture, Chinese furniture. But basically, it's just put a dent in wood, take the dent out, add water, raise it up. So it's really simple moronic stuff, and usually done moronic. Not morons do it, but if I can do it, it's pretty simple. But it's it's usually always done on a flat panel, and it was usually done with a hand plane. So the alteration or the bastardization or the morphing of it would be that I put it on convex forms and use textural tools. A woman who does amazing ukibori is Janelle Jacobson. She used to be a porcelain artist, and she does Nechki sculpture, which is they're Japanese hand sculptures. Like if I open my hand, it would be like a little tiny frog in my hand, or it could be two frogs on a piece of bamboo copulating or whatever it is, but they look like they're breathing. They're so detailed, but she does it on that scale with magnifying lens and all kinds of things. So it's been around a long time. That's one I really like. And of course it's easy. So everyone wants to do it sometimes. So.
I'll go next here. I don't really think of myself using tradition at all, but I think an important analogy for me is that you have to have a certain base of skills in which to jump off into other bigger ideas. And I don't know that I think about my base of skills. I just basically attack an object knowing innately what those skills are. I don't think about that. It's not a question of me thinking about what I can't do. I just go with a picture in my head. And I think the best analogy is that, I'm also a musician, and I'm not nearly as good a musician as I am a visual artist. So when I'm improvising, my skill base is so much smaller, and I have to really think about what it is I'm trying to craft and create in my head as I'm doing it. I'm thinking about scales and modes and all this stuff, and it's not helpful at all, especially when you're trying to create in the moment. Literally, you're trying to create in the fractions of a second. But in woodworking, whether it be a grinder or whatever tool I have in my hand, it just feels native. I don't have to think about my skill base. I just go at something with an image in my head, and that's what I want to create. It's just improvising. So do I think about mortise and tenons or any specific skill? No, I go at whatever I need to accomplish with the most appropriate skill for the job. Now, I haven't reinvented any wheels. I haven't created any special tools. Historically, I've used a lot of photo image transfer in my work, and that speaks to the whole narrative quality I'm trying to create in my work. The images are there to sort of reinforce the 3D sculptural concepts. But again, that's nothing I've created. I just, you put something on a laser printer, you put gel medium on it and you transfer it over, and then you spend 5 hours scraping the paper off. So it's nothing new, but I find that a very effective skill for getting across a very specific idea. That's what I've got to add.
Zach, if you want to add a little something before you go.
Sure.
The thing I always forget is that Sasso, when he taught me how to paint, basically he had this really dramatic, he's like I don't know, he might be one of the furthest away from Christian as I know on the planet, but anyway, but he uses tons of iconography, either iconography that he creates or looks at all this iconography. But I remember him telling me that if we kept painting like layers of paint over layers of paint, so if every one of those layers is actually transparent, then we can put color on top of color on top of color on top of color on top of color, and then the body of Christ, as in the Renaissance, that's what the painters were doing when they were doing these painting techniques. So all these glazing techniques of the Renaissance are basically how I still paint things. I just happen to use a sprayer and lots of medium, so that you just have basically, it's pigment upon pigment upon pigment. So it's just basically stacked dots of color in some spaces. So yeah, there's an old technique. Been around for a while.
Yeah, so that's like niche technique painting, right? With the different transparencies and pulling back the whites and opaques, building through like optical color mixing and such. Have you ever seen those? They're like resin paintings in which they do a little bit and then pour a little layer of resin and actually build 3D through the layers of resin. That stuff's amazing. For me, in tradition, I guess it's similar to what Erik was saying, is you have this knowledge and skill set that you acquire through experimentation and through your education lifetime, and you're able to kind of pull from that naturally and subconsciously in your creations. So for me, it's trying to think about how I translate those traditions to the modern machinery. When I first started creating, I was looking more for the like conceptual or visual traditions, and developing my own language in my, visual dialect. And so I would look at, traditional architecture from, Iran and the mosques, or Gothic cathedrals, or Shipibo textiles from Peru, and look at the different patterning and symbolic systems that were created throughout cultures and societies over time. And with that inspiration, I would try to replicate that in my process of, additive relief sculpture. And so thinking about, traditional relief sculpture, it's a solid piece that you reduce and build the layers that way. So I'm trying to create that through the reverse and building up layers with those same effects. So in looking at the, structural components of the, I think they're called muqarnas in Islamic architecture, and then like the flying buttress systems and rose windows and in cathedrals, it's like those were the inspirations, I guess, for the like layering effects and depth that I've created in my work. And then the intersections come from more of, Kumiko style and Japanese screens, and just general patterning systems. So now, because I spent so much time learning that and then developing those processes, it's completely improv now. I just look at a blank screen and experiment with my own design processes and techniques that I've developed, and just kind of let it build itself however it wants to be. I rarely go into designing with an idea in mind. Maybe I have a slight composition or like a little vision of something, and I'll mess around until it kind of tells me what it wants to do. I think right now is the first time I'm actually trying to create something conceptual again. And like the piece behind me is the first in the series, and it's all based off of like crop circles and alien symbology and stuff. And then it's also pushing, the processes and trying to develop new work in those ways as well.
Yeah, very cool. I'm glad you touched on your layering and the textures you're able to create, Zach, because that's one thing I was really taken aback by your work, is that there's such depth to it, and that you combine such different types of geometry in it. I mean, there's curves, there's more kind of, there's hexagons, there's squares, there's triangles, there's everything in there, and lots of kind of sacred geometry included as well. And I can see just that fusion of influences from around the world that you've incorporated. When I first saw one of your pieces, I was like, oh, that just looks like a cool beehive. And then I spent more time looking at it and then coming back to it. And, it's just cool how all three of you all have different kind of approaches with the medium. Like Brent, I really like the colors and the textures you're able to get on the wood. And then how some of these don't even look like they're made of wood anymore. It's kind of like a polished stone. Erik, you really tell some stories with your work, and there is that kind of sense of like whimsy and surrealism to them as well that I really like, I'm drawn to. So it's cool seeing how you do that. And then Zach, how most of your stuff's free form is pretty cool. Now I saw sometimes you collaborate with other artists too, right? There's a pretty cool Baphomet I saw on your Instagram account. So that one was much more figurative than some of your other work.
Yeah, so that's a kind of touching on the idea of, using the machine and for different things, and collaborating and getting involved in community, finding inspiration from others. That's an artist I was friends with on Instagram for a while. I just really, dig his style. And I previously have made custom canvases for people and layered sculptures and such. And that's kind of how I started too, was I was creating layered. So instead of the reductive and negative space, I was actually building up positive shapes and then priming it and going out to music festivals and then painting those, live painting over the course of a weekend and trying to just make something out of it. And so I connected with different artists and made them different canvases. So that Baphomet piece was just, you know, he made this really cool Baphomet image for like a commission for someone. It was just a 2D illustration. And I just messaged him. I was like, that's the one, dude. And he, you know, sent me the files. I made it into, you know, I reworked it into a vector style, printed it out on some, it was like the masonite that's got like the white eucalyptus coating on it. And cut that out, assembled it, shipped it to him, and he colored it in and painted it. And yeah, it's really fun being able to do stuff like that with others.
Yeah, and just finding creativity through others and being able to expand what you're able to do with someone else. And Erik, I'm just drawn back again to your analogy about music and how a lot of it is like you're building up kind of your vocabulary, your skill set, and then able to kind of create with someone, improvise and jam with them, you know, maybe through sculptural piece or through group painting on a series as well. Very cool stuff. So we're rounding the corner, y'all. So the next question, getting a little, you know, more heavy. So what's historically associated with men? And diversity seems to be an issue for a lot of art making, whether it be issues of gender or race. So do you see similar issues facing wood artists with it being in terms of a lack of diversity or it being a boys club?
I'll jump in here again. I mean, obviously, so much of woodworking for the longest time, and to this day, looks a lot like Brent and I, middle-aged, gray-haired white guys. And I don't think any of us want to see that. I mean, I'm sure Brent's probably helping to educate as many women and as people of color as possible. I certainly would like to see the field broaden, and it has broadened. I mean, the women in this field have brought so much more to it than all the white middle-class old guys can. And again,
go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Again, in our podcast, we've really tried to bring out some wonderful makers. Our last 3 interviews were Adrienne Siegel, an incredible conceptual maker. You have to look her up. I mean, she does all this work based on data, on tide tables, on forest fires, an incredible conceptual artist, but trained as a furniture maker. Sylvie Rosenthal, an amazing force of nature, amazing work. And then B.A. Harrington, which was actually the one that we just aired. It's the one that's actually live now on our website and on Stitcher and iTunes.
I was going to say that was where I was kind of disappointed in who was going to be on this call, because then I remember, the exhibition doesn't have that. I don't know what you have in the exhibition. I remember that being one thing I thought, like, this could be a little bit more diverse. Mm-hmm. And one hat tip I would give would be to the Furniture Society, because basically that's a group of people right now that I know primary, you know, at least half of the leaders are people of color, women. It's a much more diverse universe than it was in 1997 when I was a co-founder of the whole thing, you know, because that was people that were 10 to 15 to 20 years older than me at that point. So that's one place where you can look at it. Of course, you know, college universities are a place where you can too, but I'm actually, I mean, you know, in a traditional conference of the Furniture Society used to be, you know, the big joke was like a bunch of educators that got to come have fun for the summer, part of the summer, and then a bunch of white dudes who long ago left society and held up in their wood shops by themselves, and they'd come out for the same party, you know, and then these things would come together. And some really beautiful things happen in those spaces. I would say too, another hat tip to Furniture Society is they have a project that we're working with them on now called Craft for a Greater Good. And that's basically look at how can we step outside of our studio, see ourselves as not leaders actually, but sustainers and supporters and people that can lift up specifically by skill share, by resource share, by either leadership and collaboration, however you want to see it, but it's some sort of community project that brings things together. So check that out if you haven't seen that. But for the most part right now, if you said, who's hot in contemporary American furniture, I'm going to name a bunch of women.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the greatest shows recently, if you ask me, was the one that was at the Center for Wood Art in Philadelphia recently. And I'm going to try to remember the name of it. It's a pretty simple name, if I remember right. I'll think of it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, we were supposed to interview Christina Madsen, who is actually the Furniture Society's Award of Distinction honoree. And actually, it's also important to add that, you know, the Furniture Society, a wonderful organization, was started by a woman, Sarah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm totally blanking on her last name. Sarah and Bob. Bob was her husband. He was a wood turner. She was an architect.
Yeah, I'll think of Sarah's name too. You're right.
Yeah, in Charlottesville, Virginia. Anyways, yes. So the Furniture Society, an incredible organization that has really been encouraging diversity in our field since its inception.
Yeah, so I want to believe that like all artists are open-minded, and a lot of us are sick of the gender inequalities and race equalities, not just in art making, but in our society as a whole. I mean, like, I can't really speak on the woodworking community, but in the metal industry and concrete industry, it's definitely seen as like a masculine thing. And I find it ridiculous. I think that, you know, opportunity in this country specifically is always more leaning towards white men, and it's bullshit. I think, like, personally, yeah, some of my favorite art, like all my favorite artists right now are women in various media. I don't really pay attention to like a lot of art. I don't really want to like find influence from things that are similar to myself, but I follow a lot of tattoo artists, and yeah, there's some amazing people out there who are not white guys. But I'm just like, yeah, especially in today's social climate, it is definitely a heavy topic. Yeah, I think that it is much harder for people of color and for women and those who identify or are, you know, born in under gender circumstances. They're just not taken as seriously. And then especially when you get into like the top tier art world, it's even harder to break into that. And it's, you know, a lot of it's controlled by people with money. And it's a lot about who you know. And so, you know, you look at it objectively, you can have, you know, a man and a woman, and they have like the same exact skill set and same exact experience. And, you know, the man's probably gonna get the job, and that's just ridiculous. I want to see more diversity everywhere. I mean, I grew up in South Florida, in Miami, and that was a very different world than North Carolina. But Southern culture is something I've never resonated with. And as someone who, you know, finds more inspiration from the world, I want to get out there and see more of it and immerse myself in different cultures and aspects of society. I'm very sick of this patriarchal, misogynist thing we've got going in this part of the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think once you started hanging out with folks of, man, they got like 7 different mentions for the Furniture Society. But by the way, there's a bunch of white dudes that helped Sarah get it off the ground too. But, you know, that was
about them.
Yeah, but the whole focus was basically, how can we get all these university students, which we know are much more diverse than the rest of the population that might be, you know, you do-it-yourselfer, or I mean, one of my least favorite places to go would be the woodworking store, you know, because pretty much knew who I'm going to meet. And then at the same time, some of the most enriching classes I ever taught were in Charlotte, and most everyone was over 65 and retired, and so but I think you'd find that if you really expanded the conversation out into the national field and then started to look at who's teaching in the furniture programs. As someone who came in to academia in 1990, we needed not another white man in any art department across the United States. I can tell you in 30 years, it has shifted. It just like flipped up. So we still need work on that. I find it to be one of the harder places, actually, our field, to get people to engage in, specifically because if it's the same reason as I can't convince them all that'd be a great idea to be a painter either, because you have to think about making a living. And so I just want to go say that we've given a lot of tips to the furniture society. At the same time, I do know my place of privilege just walking in who I am, and I'm doing everything I can within that place of privilege, specifically at the university and in the community here in Asheville to help make that shift. The kids are the answer, by the way. Just so you know.
They are. And actually, I sort of feel remiss, and one of the greatest women in the woodworking field that's really pushed things forward is the former head of the program at San Diego State, Wendy Murayama.
Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, she's really pushed this field forward for women. And
Gail Ferdell.
Gail Ferdell, yes, exactly. So, I mean, there's so many great women that should be mentioned and need to be mentioned before a bunch of old.
I'll chime in and say one of my favorite public artists, Ursula von Zratingvark.
Oh man, yeah.
Insane. Yeah. I mean, I just drool at her piece at NCMA all the time. She's amazing.
Yeah, and so it definitely appears, we're in the midst of a paradigm shift within our society and within the art world, and we can only hope that it continues and that it sticks. And I think that y'all touched on an interesting point too, is that where's the money coming from? Whose art has historically just really been commission based for a lot of big pieces, especially looking, at these large scale pieces that we have, either public art or art that's sacred or in different places. And then who was commissioning that? Who were the people that were receiving those funds? And it, seems to be overwhelmingly white men. So in our exhibit here, we have 14 exhibiting artists. There are 2 women. One is in a partnership with her husband. They do Mabel Studios. And so they do kind of a blend between furniture and fine art. And so you can see one of their pieces directly behind me, this buffet with the hand-hewn wood front, and then it has some carved tools that are painted with milk paint. We also have Aspen Golann, who's the wood shop manager or director over at Pinland. And it's pretty interesting because of the artists that we have in the exhibit that are doing the most traditional furniture forms, it's Aspen, right? So she is doing some really cool stuff with her work where she's doing these traditional furniture forms, but incorporating enamel painting and as well as glass work. So she's making her own glass, she's doing her own enamel painting, and doing a lot of incredible hand carved pieces and really kind of getting the expression of the natural grain. And then we have one African-American exhibiting artist in the show, Derrick Beasley, who's based out of Durham, and his work is very rooted in social change and social commentary. But yeah, it's definitely one thing that we know that we need to get more diversity in the museum, and just finding it through the field. And
keep in mind too, Aspen was trained at a very traditional furniture making school, so that's why she's got those chops.
She go to North Bennett Street School, right? And that's where B.A. Harrington, the woman who's head of the furniture design program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, trained as well. I mean, it's very interesting to see what she's done with her skills, where she has taken some very traditional forms, mainly the dowry chest, and maintained its traditional structure and function, but turned it into an object about feminism. It's turned from a traditional object into a piece of conceptual sculpture, and that's what she's done with her skill base, which is pretty amazing.
I mean, the other thing to keep in mind too is that you mentioned Wendell at the very beginning, and of course Wendell, one thing he did basically in opposition to all these people who were making things in the late 70s, early 80s into the 90s, like when studio furniture really bloomed, is one thing he did is he never called himself a furniture maker. Never.
True.
Ever. And then also most of his pieces that were furniture were made by a man named Stephen Proctor during that time. All those carvings, not all the laminated stuff, but much of those things were made by people that had their chops making furniture, and specifically studio furniture. than, you know, making his sculpture. But at the time, you know, too, you look at the field at that time too. I mean, you know, 80s in the United States of America, not the most diverse place, that's for damn sure. Also, and I have to tell you too, is that I love my client base, but I'm particularly more choosy now about who I communicate with and who, I don't know, it's not even about toleration. It's just who I want to experience as a person, where the stuff's going to live, who's going to see it. Is it going to be two people on a mountain somewhere? I'm like, well, I don't know, really. But, you know, it's just, you know, it's so try to develop a relationship with those people so you can basically have any of that change happen. It's really slow change, obviously, but I think we're talking about it now because of what's up in the world, but we've been talking about it for a long time in studio furniture.
Yeah, actually, interestingly enough, one of my favorite stories about my woodworking career is before I went to woodworking school, I worked in a small architectural mill shop in Pittsburgh, and it was run by a woman. And we were building this large architectural door with two side lights, big mahogany door. And it was just freestanding up in the shop. It might've had a couple of crutches holding up, and the whole thing, because nobody had secured it well enough, just came crashing down and smashed into 1,000 pieces on the floor of the shop. And Vicky, she didn't scream, she didn't yell, she didn't do anything. She just started picking up the pieces and started rebuilding it. And it was just like, that to me characterizes the whole difference of a woman running a shop. Had it been in some of the other shops that I worked in run by men, all hell would have broken loose. It was like, nope,
I'll let Erik handle all the speculation about gender. I'm not touching it.
Yeah, no, it's not speculation about gender, but there's definitely a different approach. Had an old white guy run that shop. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily making a poor generalization.
Is nature important to your work, and how do you choose what to use? Do you ever use found materials? You know, is nature an inspiration either through subject matter or materials for you? And Zak, you said you used to do sculptures with branches, right? So you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so, you know, Andy Goldsworthy, everybody knows Andy Goldsworthy. I made work like him in a way when I was first getting started doing like guerrilla earthworks installations. So I would go out in nature and just find objects. I kept like a saw and an axe in my car at all times. And if I saw downed trees on the side of the road, I'd go chop them up and throw them in my trunk and bring them home, and basically kept like a stockpile of tree branches on my porch for a long time. And yeah, I would just make sculptures and find ways to weave them into different things. One of my first like art opportunities was at a music festival in South Carolina, and I helped build a stage made of big timber that we found on the site, and I helped this other artist create this like sacred space. He went by the name Nature, and he created nests. And so like it was these like, you know, circular structures of woven branches, and then throughout it were different little earthwork mandalas and places for like congregation. They would have different ceremonies and, you know, yoga and meditation and stuff throughout the weekend. And so it was just really interesting immersion into that world, and seeing, you know, how you can just walk around and observe your surroundings. I think it's somewhat of a practice of mindfulness and just like awareness and consciousness in your surroundings to see the beauty all around you at all times. And if you want to commune with nature and create together, and there's different, you know, if you know Andy Goldsworthy's philosophies and concepts, he, you know, talks a lot about the different approaches and how you can work with it or against it. Sometimes like things are just beyond your control, and you can create all you want, and nature might come and just destroy it instantly. Kind of like what Erik was talking about, you know, with a piece you work on forever, like the piece in the gallery, if that thing breaks, it breaks, you know, and that's just it. I'm not going to cry or get angry. That's life, you know, it's chaos and order, and you just go with the flow. So I guess in my current work, nature does have some bit involvement because of the material I work with. I mean, all of us work with wood, so yeah, just on that standpoint, nature is a part of the work. And then in relation to, I guess, sacred geometry, nature has some of the most intricate natural geometries and fractals occurring within it. And I find that stuff to be more impossible to replicate than man-made geometry, which is interesting in the aspects of like Islamic culture and their architecture. They don't have a figurative thing for God. It's the the positive aspects of the geometry, and the negative aspects is that balance between the physical realm and the ether and the cosmos and heavens, or whatever you want to call it. So I guess in that belief system, nature is God, and like we're all a part of nature. So like personally, I believe everything's just random probabilities and just chaos and whatever. And I think that, the beauty in like our existence. And so for me, the connection between that is, how humans have taken, inspiration from their surroundings or from their cultures and developed these patterning systems. And you see throughout the world how, throughout time and space, every culture has a certain symbol or motif or patterning that is specific to them. And when you see those patterns, you know where it comes from. But at the same time, it's like this whole collective consciousness of these different societies who have no connection, yet they're still on that same wavelength of creating this type of imagery. So I guess in my work, it's more of like the human nature versus the, biological nature.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So Erik, you have a piece in the exhibit right now, The Troubled Waters, that kind of talks, it looks more about like the damage that nature is experiencing from human acts. But so could you talk about the role that nature has in your work, or if you use found objects?
I think all of the above. I mean, I think I'm willing to use anything and everything as fair game for a narrative concept. Ideas are such a tricky thing. Getting a hold of the muse means it can come from anywhere, and the materials can come from anywhere. So that piece never started out being a political piece. It started out with a found object, and then it just evolved from there. So I'm just willing to roll with whatever is going to make the concept or the narrative work. And it can come from anywhere or anything. And I think I don't make a lot of work. Each one of my pieces take far too damn long to as simple as they are, they take far too long to evolve conceptually till I'm happy with them, that I just let the pieces of the puzzle come together as they may over time.
Mm-hmm. So Brent, do you, is nature a big influence in your work, or do you ever use found objects? Nope, you're still muted.
It's an influence for sure. Probably just speak about the biggest influence ever in nature in my work would be a trip in 1997 to southern Utah for 3 weeks. I went out thinking that brown didn't mean much, gray didn't mean much, blacks didn't mean a whole lot. It's kind of stuck somewhere in about 1988 Miami Vice or something like that for a color scheme, and came back knowing a lot more about what color the sky was and what color rocks were. And then I'll bring all of that into the work. And then where I'm kind of with Zak on the experience of chaos in nature, or what seems to be chaos. Actually, I think it's pretty divine and actually not chaos. But if we experience it as that, or randomness, which I don't think is random either. So I love the idea that you brought up God and you bring up the idea of divinity in all of this, because the pieces that you all have actually are closer to those strands and things that run within me that are more, I'll call them divine. I'll call them my natural sense or my natural way of being. And so sometimes when I'm making things that, get being human gets in the way. So those pieces that you have in that show, I'm less human when I'm more in the flow, I think, when I was making those things. And it has to do with the emotional meaning and all of that. And then the other thing I would say is like, yeah, if I want to definitely, really tweak myself, then I don't go into nature. Yeah, that would work. You wouldn't want to be around me much. But for me, it's not taking that one event and moving it in. It's actually taking the groundedness I experienced there, moving that into the studio, adding the right playlist, adding the right podcast, adding the right reading, whatever it is. And then getting into, the thing that Erik said again earlier was, where can I make jazz?
That's great. Yeah, where can I make jazz? That's a really, really good way of putting it. So I've just really enjoyed this conversation with you all so much, and appreciate you taking so much of your time to talk with us. And so the last question that I have today is, what's your favorite wood to work with and why?
I like free wood. It's good.
Yeah.
I
was going to say that's my favorite kind of wood too.
I use basswood because it doesn't have really any distinctive grain, and I can make it look like a plastic rock, a metal rock. I can make it look like anything I want to make it look like. It paints really well. So oftentimes when I get that question, I'm just like looking at people, you really just asked me that question? I mean, not that I don't love, some crazy ass, or excuse the expression, but crazy veneer, specifically walnut and some sort of burl, all of that's beautiful. But for me, the form has to go with that. And so when they don't, then why am I putting this texture and this color on this form? So I love mahogany too, man. Mahogany is awesome, but not very sustainable. It's not on the continent. So what I try to focus now is like mostly things that are on this continent, or that some dude building his yacht had certainly would order, and now I can get my 1/6 inch veneer without feeling guilty because it's sitting right there and they're getting ready to throw it away. So
yeah, and I'm pretty much along the same lines. If I can get political about it, I think a lot of people in the traditional furniture field feel that wood has a precious element to it and it adds value to your work. And I would take just the antithesis of that point of view. I would say that I bring preciousness to the work, and the material just aids me in getting there. And whatever material is going to aid me in getting there, I mean, yes, I'd love to carve a beautiful piece of mahogany. It carves like a dream. It's really, it doesn't do the world any good, certainly to be carving, quote unquote, precious materials. I can get a piece of domestic cherry that most other people wouldn't use because it's full of sap and knots, and carve it, and it'll work just fine for my purposes because I'm probably going to paint it. Or poplar or anything. Again, it's sort of whatever serves the purpose of my ends within a sort of a sense of appropriateness. I don't want to use any precious materials that have been mined out of the third world by slave labor.
Yeah, we're all on the same page here. Definitely the right material for the right job. Touching on the subject of, fine craft versus fine art, alchemy, transmutation, all that. It's, you're not interested in the art because the materials we're using. You're interested because it's our expression, it's our craft, it's our, our mind and energy and life source being put into these creations. I think, the right person can take any material they want and then create anything with it, as long as you have that vision for it. It's the execution that matters, not the material per se. I mean, in my work, I use relatively low quality materials, not only because it's I can't find 4x8 sheets of solid wood. That's just impossible. So like I have to get plywood, and I mean, my favorite plywood is this dude in like Ohio makes his own specialized plywood for like aircrafts, and he has a melamine composites and like all different types of veneers you can get. It's just the most amazing stuff to cut on the laser, but it's $100 for a 4x8 sheet, and that's not sustainable and it's not cost efficient, you know? So thankfully I can source like really high quality Baltic birch, and I really like using that. I used to like go to scrap yards and things, and I worked in a cabinet shop for a little bit and would, you know, take over leftovers and repurpose them. I think in the idea of like natural sustainability, like, yeah, I completely agree that as makers, you need to be aware of your footprint on the earth. And, you know, we do consume and create waste in our creations, and to minimize that and you know, leave the environment for others to do the same for the future. Like that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the most efficient person of these three I'll judge using materials would be Zach, because pretty sure can do a lot with that kerf, do a lot with that, taking this one and moving it to that one. Yeah, so that's awesome stuff. I was really, like I said, really impressed with the work. So how much is the
Likewise.
piece? How much is the piece behind you, like that newer one, the bigger one, the bigger piece?
Pardon?
How much is the bigger piece behind you?
Price wise?
Yeah.
$6,666.
Good. Oh, wow. COVID price, it sounds like. All hell's going to handbasket. Okay.
Yeah, the one in the gallery is $10K. And then so every piece in this series, they're around the same size. Like this one's like 2x6, but the fabrication in this one's very different because you can't really tell, but it's in like different sections. So like this is one whole piece, and then these are actual individual pieces.
All that, yeah.
So it's able to like transport and move differently, whereas the one at Brum is just like one solid big piece. So, and then I'm making like this series, there's going to be 3 of them, and they're all going to be that same price.
Well, yeah, y'all have beautiful work, and I appreciate you taking your time out today to talk with us.